Alright, so for my project 2, I'm going to talk about the Myth of Theseus. So, yeah. Everybody talks about Theseus all the time, and how he was a hero and defeated the Minotaur, and how his father was a god and a king. But he also meets a lot of people and monsters along the way on his journey, and they help out a lot, and he wouldn't have a story if they weren't there. To start with, Theseus' mom. To keep her son safe from her father's enemies, King Aegeus, they lived in poverty until he was old enough to take care of himself, just to keep him safe. So, because if the king's enemies knew that he had an heir, they would immediately try to kill the son, who was not strong enough to protect himself. Because he was a pretty small guy, so he had trouble and he got bullied by other kids all the time. And so one day he was laying on a beach, and a seagull approached him and gave him advice to help him gain the strength to become what he would in the future. He told him that the key to strength was to use his enemy's strength and size against them. Because he's a small guy, he has to think more, I feel like, to get the same results as people who just have brute strength. And the seagull basically gives Theseus the push to start his journey and all that. And so the next day, he, a stone with a sword in it shows up in the middle of his town, and the messenger who had brought it along says that whoever is able to pull it out, they're the heir to a throne, and they have to go find their father if they're able to do it. So Theseus shows up, and he goes to start pulling out the sword, and all the townspeople laugh at him because he's always been weak and small to them. And I really like Theseus because he's really sarcastic, which you don't really see that often in stories like this. Like, when they're all laughing at him, he's like, "Oh, I'm so delighted that I amused you. Now watch me do this." And he pulls it out super easily and basically blows them all away. And then he walks away and starts his journey after saying goodbye to his mom. So he takes the long route because the seagull told him to, which is through a really bad area, and it's filled with bandits and monsters and basically just a horrible place. And so the first enemy he meets is a bandit holding a huge brass club. And let's be honest, this bandit isn't really very smart. All Theseus has to do is sort of taunt him about his club and say, like, "Oh, that's not real brass. There's no way you'd be able to hold it if it were." And so, to prove him wrong, he gives Theseus the club without any, like, "Oh yeah, let me just give my enemy my weapon. It's a good idea." So Theseus kills him by bashing his head in with his club and takes the club with him. And then he walks along and continues his journey, and the next enemy that he meets is a guy sitting on a rock by a cliff holding this giant axe. And his name is Siron, which Theseus heard stories about him already. So Siron stops him and tells him to wash his feet, and if he doesn't, he's going to cut his head off with his axe. But knowing what Siron does, Theseus knows that he likes to kick people off the cliff while they're washing his feet to feed them to his giant man-eating turtle, whatever that's about. And so when he's washing his feet, he feels Siron about to kick him, so he grabs his ankle and throws him over the cliff instead, and his turtle eats him, and he's gone. So then he continues his journey, and he meets another man, Pitiocampus, who ends up being Siron's brother. I don't think that's really relevant to the story. He's pretty cool, and he has a really cool death, actually. So, whenever he hears someone coming, he bends a tree over by, like, holding the top of it. And when the person approaches, he's like, "Oh, can you hold this for a second? I need to go do something." And so, when they hold it, they get flung by the tree and die by being flung through the air and hitting the ground. So he asks Theseus to do this when he starts to pass him, and Theseus, basically, knowing the story, he uses the power of his will to direct every strength that he has into his legs and hold the tree there. So Pitiocampus is really surprised, obviously, because nobody's been able to do that before. So he gets closer to see if maybe he broke the tree when he pulled it down earlier. And Theseus lets go, hitting Pitiocampus in the head and knocking him out. So while he's unconscious, Theseus ties his wrists to one tree and his ankles to another, and then lets go of the trees, ripping Pitiocampus in half, and he's dead, and Theseus won. Finally, he meets the last enemy of this road, whose name is Procrustes, and he's an innkeeper. And his inn has a bunch of skulls and bones littered all over the place, and Theseus goes in anyway, because he's like, oh, alright, let's see what this is about. And so the guy says that he really wants things to be neat and organized and doesn't like when they're not. And so when he leads him to the bed that Theseus is going to sleep on, he's like, if you are too short, I'll use these bindings and stretch you out so you fit the bed. And if you're too tall, I'm going to cut your legs off so that you fit the bed. And Theseus doesn't want to do that, obviously. So when Procrustes starts to push him over to the bed, he uses his size against him and pushes him backwards and flips him onto the bed himself and ties him down and cuts off his legs so he can fit in the bed. And then, because he doesn't want him to suffer, he cuts his head off too. So that was pretty easy. And then he decides he wanted to sleep outside because it was too depressing in there, I guess. So he finally reaches Athens, and his father, King Aegeus, tells him about King Minos and how he demands a tribute of 7 boys and 7 girls every year to make up for a war that had happened in the past. So Theseus really wants to stop this because it seems pointless to sacrifice these people. And so he gets his father to agree to make him one of the tributes. So he goes forward to Crete, which is where Minos lives, and demands to meet Minos. And Minos is kind of impressed by him because he's really clever. So he agrees that if Theseus is able to defeat the Minotaur in the labyrinth, that he will stop demanding the tributes from Athens. So Minos has 2 daughters, and his older daughter, Ariadne, comes to Theseus and tells him that she's in love with him, and that she'll help him find his way through the labyrinth if she'll take him with her when he leaves after defeating the Minotaur. So he agrees, and they go to the labyrinth when the time comes, and using her, she has this basically magic ball of string that can lead them safely through the labyrinth. And so he finally meets the Minotaur, who is not cute. He has the body of a man and the head of a bull, but he's completely covered in fur. And Theseus doesn't have any weapons because Minos thought it would give him too much of an advantage. So he's basically just sparring with this Minotaur until he gets a chance to swing onto his back. And when the Minotaur tries to punch him off, he moves really quickly so that the Minotaur hits himself instead. And so, using the few seconds when the Minotaur is disoriented, he uses his foot and pushes it against the Minotaur's head and rips off one of the Minotaur's horns. So now he has a weapon to use. And they're more on equal ground now, and they fight, and finally Theseus wins by stabbing the Minotaur with his horn. So they gather, he goes back with Ariadne, and they gather the tributes, and they leave the labyrinth, and everyone's waiting outside. And surprisingly, Minos doesn't seem that angry that his daughter helped Theseus, and he just lets her go with him. And Minos doesn't really seem like that much of a bad guy. I mean, he demanded these tributes and everything, but he agreed to the deal, and he didn't go against his agreement after he lost, basically. So Theseus and the tributes and his crew and his new princess, they all go back to Athens, but they forgot that when they had left, they promised the king that they would use white sails if they had succeeded, and black sails if Theseus had died. So they leave the black sails up, not thinking about it, and they return to Athens, and King Aegeus, who's been waiting to see if they succeeded or not, sees the black sails in the distance and commits suicide. So basically, for all Theseus's accomplishments and heroics and cleverness, he wasn't able to save his father, so he's a hero, but he isn't really heroic. But that's it.